This is Facility Science Podcast number 16. I am Jason Doolittle, and today I'm talking about Lockout, Tagout, sometimes abbreviated LOTO, L-O-T-O, LOTO. And I'm going to cover this topic in the context of the standard set by OSHA in the United States. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and that's just because that's the applicable standard where I am. And while other countries may have different regulatory agencies and standards, the general lockout, tagout concepts are universal. And also, I want to make it clear that I don't consider myself to be an expert on this topic. I'm sharing with you what I have learned through both experience and study over the years, and you should definitely consult with your trusted safety experts and insurance providers and local regulatory agencies and experienced technicians and etc. So what is lockout tagout? This is a practice intended to protect maintenance and service workers, and also nearby workers and bystanders from being exposed to hazardous energy during servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment. And exposure to hazardous energy in this case could be due to unexpected energization or startup of the equipment during service or maintenance, or due to the release of energy that's stored in the equipment while the worker is working on the equipment. And hazardous energy can be electricity, it can be thermal energy, steam or hot parts or hot air. It could be energy stored in hydraulic or pneumatic devices. It could be energy stored in compressed gas systems. It could be mechanical energy stored in things like springs or in gravitational potential. Or it could be something large and or heavy that might move unexpectedly. And the basic idea of lockout tagout is that before we work on anything that might expose us to hazardous energy, we are going to identify the sources of hazardous energy and disconnect them, and then secure them in such a way that only the worker or workers doing the work can reconnect the source of hazardous energy to the equipment. And this is typically done using a padlock or something similarly strong, with the key to the lock being controlled by the worker. And then we also want to identify any sources of stored energy in the equipment and either safely release the stored energy or secure the energy storage mechanisms in such a way that the energy won't be released during the service work while the worker is in harm's way. And the disconnecting means or energy isolation devices that we're going to lock out or otherwise secure are things like circuit breakers or disconnecting switches or valves, or basically anything that can be operated or removed or otherwise blocked to prevent the release of hazardous energy. Sometimes we're going to do dangerous things in order to maintain a certain level of safety and comfort and productivity, but there's no reason to make those things any more dangerous than they need to be. And lockout tagout is one of the ways we try to address that idea. All right, so let's get now into the OSHA standard, and this can be found in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, and that's 1910.147, where this standard is. And first, let's talk about where the standard applies. This lockout tagout standard applies when an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or other safety device. And this can be simple things like the outside casing or body panels of a machine, right, that might expose moving parts or electrical components. It could also be something similarly simple as the ballast cover inside a fluorescent light fixture. Anytime you're going to remove something that's going to expose a dangerous, hazardous energy source, this applies. It also applies when an employee is required to place any part of their body into an area on a machine or a piece of equipment where work is actually performed upon the material being processed, or when an associated danger zone exists during a machine operating cycle. So there's always a spot that says, don't put your hands past this line, or don't stand here while the machine is operating. Anytime you expect an employee to put their hand past the line or stand in the place they're not supposed to stand, this lockout tagout standard applies. The lockout tagout standard specifically doesn't apply when the worker is working on a cord and plug connected equipment where unplugging the equipment eliminates the risk of exposure to hazardous energy, as long as the person performing the work has exclusive control of the plug. So basically, in order for someone to plug the machine back in, they would have to sort of forcefully take the plug from the control of the maintenance worker, and then they wouldn't be able to do so without it being very clear to the worker that they need to get out of the way. And it should also be noted that if the work is being done on a piece of plug-connected equipment, but the plug is, say, across the room from where the worker is actually working, then the lockout tagout standard does apply in that case. And also there are some other sort of industry-specific exceptions in the pipeline and electric utility industries, and also in construction and other industries, which are things that I'm not super familiar with. My guess is that if you're involved in any of these situations, you probably know about this. All right, so now who is responsible for lockout tagout? And the simple answer to that is everyone is responsible for this. And the responsibility in all cases might be legal, ethical, or moral, and usually kind of all of the above. So and before I talk about responsibilities, I want to give two definitions from the OSHA standard. And the first one is an affected employee. So an affected employee is an employee whose job requires him or her to operate or use a machine or equipment on which servicing or maintenance is being performed under lockout or tagout, or whose job requires him or her to work in an area in which servicing or maintenance is being performed. And then the other definition is an authorized employee. So under OSHA standard, an authorized employee is a person who locks out or tags out machine or equipment in order to perform servicing or maintenance on that machine or equipment. An affected employee becomes an authorized employee when that employee's duties include performing servicing or maintenance covered under this section. All right, so responsibility, let's start with the employer. Under the OSHA rules, it is the employer's responsibility to, and this is quoting from the standard again, to establish a program and utilize procedures for affixing appropriate lockout devices or tagout devices to energy isolating devices, and to otherwise disable machines or equipment to prevent unexpected energization, startup, or release of stored energy in order to prevent injury to employees. So this means that for each piece of equipment or for each maintenance procedure, whichever makes the most sense, the employer will identify the sources of hazardous energy and identify the means to disconnect or otherwise control exposure to the sources of hazardous energy. And this information, along with the exact lockout procedures, should be documented in a way that is available to and clearly understandable by the people who will be performing the work. And quoting from the standard again, the procedure shall clearly and specifically outline the scope, purpose, authorization, rules, and techniques to be utilized for the control of hazardous energy and the means to enforce compliance, including but not limited to the following. The first is a specific statement of the intended use of the procedure. Second is specific procedural steps for shutting down, isolating, blocking, and securing machines or equipment to control hazardous energy. Third, specific procedural steps for the placement, removal, and transfer of lockout devices or tagout devices and the responsibility for them. And the fourth, specific requirements for testing a machine or equipment to determine and verify the effectiveness of the lockout devices, tagout devices, and other energy control measures. Basically, before authorizing an employee to perform potentially dangerous work, the employer will train that employee on the hazards associated with the work they'll be expected to do and the procedures necessary to protect themselves from those hazards. So this is the lockout, tagout procedures. This is not only the legal requirement from OSHA's perspective, but this is also sort of a moral and ethical requirement that before we put an employee or a worker in harm's way, we let them know that they're going to be in harm's way, and we let them know how they can protect themselves from the potential danger there. Okay, the employer will also provide all of the appropriate protective materials and hardware. So that's the locks and the tags and the chains or wedges or blocks or pins or whatever else is required to properly secure the sources of hazardous energy in each situation. And then another requirement in the OSHA standard for the employer is that the employer will conduct periodic inspection, that procedures are being carried out properly. So this is an audit, and OSHA says that this audit should happen at least annually. And the inspection should be done by an authorized employee other than the one actually carrying out the energy control procedure. Basically, we want someone who understands the LOTO procedure and the hazards associated with the service or maintenance work to look over the shoulder of the person performing the LOTO procedure and verify that they are properly following the procedure. And inspections should be documented with respect to the procedure being used, the date of the inspection, the employees included in the inspection, and the inspector. And this is all required by the OSHA standard. And then additionally, the employer is responsible for training affected employees. So that's not necessarily the authorized employees that are carrying out the maintenance work, but the affected employees and other employees working in the facility about their responsibilities under lockout tagout. Now, the responsibilities of the maintenance or service employee, and as I said before, OSHA calls this the authorized employee. The first responsibility of anyone doing any kind of work really is to understand the dangers associated with the work they're expected to do and the means to protect themselves and others around them. So if you're this person, it's your responsibility to decline to do a job if you don't understand what can go wrong and how to prevent it. Right? You want to go home to your family. You want to not die over something that could be easily prevented. It's your responsibility to make sure you understand what's going to happen when you open a machine or grab onto a part or whatever. And if you don't understand that, it's your responsibility to say, I'm not going to do that because I don't understand what's happening here. Now, before work is started, the authorized employee should follow the equipment-specific hazardous energy control procedure, and that will include, this is in the written procedure that we talked about before, that will include the notify all affected employees, right? So that's the equipment operators or other nearby employees that might be affected by the release of hazardous energy in the area. Let them know what's going to happen and what they should do. Then the next thing is to properly shut down the equipment, and this should be done again by a documented procedure, because improper shutdown might create sort of unexpected or undocumented consequences inside the system. So shut down with a properly documented procedure. Then isolate the equipment from sources of hazardous energy. Apply the appropriate lockout or tagout devices. That's what we're talking about here. You flip the disconnect or close the valve, and then put a lock on it to make sure that no one can operate that device while the work is being done. Then we want to release or otherwise secure any sources of stored or residual energy inside the equipment. And then finally, verify that isolation has been achieved by the appropriate tests or measurements or observations. And again, this should be documented in the procedure. Then when work is complete, it's time to re-energize the equipment. And that should be done again in an orderly fashion. First, we want to remove all non-essential items from the area, right? You don't want to leave your wrench inside the machine where it might make contact with something it shouldn't and blow something up. And make sure the machine or equipment is properly reassembled. No one can get hurt. Nothing can be launched outside or whatever. And also in working order, and that the controls of the machine or equipment are in a safe configuration for re-energization. The worker will also ensure that all employees are in a safe place relative to the potential hazard of re-energization. Again, should be included in the procedure. Then we will remove all the lockout devices and energize the equipment. And finally, once everything's good, the authorized employee will notify the affected employees that the equipment is no longer under lockout tagout and they can continue their normal operation. Okay, next we have the equipment operators or other employees working nearby. These are the affected employees under OSHA. And the main responsibility here is that these workers should understand the purpose of lockout tagout and how it will be used in their area, right? They want to understand their specific responsibilities and hazards and things like, don't attempt to operate or energize the machine because you might hurt the person who's working on it. It might include when the equipment is being opened up or re-energized, you're supposed to leave the area if necessary. Those sorts of things in order to protect themselves, the affected employees need to understand. And then finally, everyone else in the facility, so not the authorized employees or the affected employees, but everyone else should at the very least understand the purposes of lockout tagout and be able to identify the lockout tagout devices and understand not to try to energize these locked out or tagged out equipment or not to attempt to remove the LOTO devices. Okay, so I've been talking about lockout tagout as one thing. So what's the difference in when do we use one and when do we use the other? A lockout device is, from the standard, a device that utilizes a positive means, such as a lock, either key or combination type, to hold an energy isolating device in a safe position and prevent the energizing of a machine or equipment. Included are blank flanges and bolted slip blinds. And there's some disagreement over whether blank flanges and bolted slip blinds are actually technically lockout devices, which is we'll say outside the scope of this podcast. From a practical perspective, we only need to consider whether they provide the intended degree of protection in the circumstances that we're going to use them as safety devices. Now, a tagout device, again from the standard, is a prominent warning device, such as a tag and a means of attachment, which can be securely fastened to an energy isolating device in accordance with an established procedure to indicate that the energy isolating device and the equipment being controlled may not be operated until the tagout device is removed. And the main difference is that the lockout device is more robust and physically prevents operation of the energy isolating device, while a tagout device is more of an indicator. And while tagout devices are required to be reasonably robust, they don't provide anything near the degree of protection that a lockout device provides. And this is something that the employees who are using these procedures should also clearly be made to understand the difference between the protection provided by a lockout device and a tagout device. And the OSHA standard, and maybe also common sense, basically says that we should use lockout unless we can't. And additionally, if we use tagout instead of lockout, we have to demonstrate that the tagout procedure provides the same degree of protection that a lockout procedure would. And that's maybe we need to take additional steps to isolate energy or whatever we need to do to make sure the employees are as safe with a tag as they would have been with a lock. Okay, now I want to talk about what if we have groups of people locking out a device, or we have work that spans multiple shifts, or we have outside contractors working in our facility. All right, so the first one is sometimes there are more than one person working on a particular job where a lockout tagout procedure is required. In this case, the lockout arrangement should be configured so that each worker can apply their own lock, and each individual worker's lock should be sufficient to control the source of hazardous energy. In other words, the energy isolating device should not be operable until the last worker removes their lock. And there are various methods to accomplish this depending on the exact circumstances. And one example is a device that clamps through the lockout point, and then that device itself then can have multiple locks applied to it. And so that device won't operate and come off the energy isolating device until all of the locks are removed. Another example would be to use a lock with a separate key, and that key is held in a lockbox, and then each of the workers on the group lockout situation would apply their lock to the lockbox, and the lockbox can't be opened until all the locks are removed. Again, there's various methods to accomplish this, and use the one that's most applicable to your situation. Another case is when workers span multiple shifts. So you have one person might be working on one shift, and that maintenance or service work is going to continue through to another shift. Well, the standard requires procedures to transfer the LOTO control between outgoing and incoming employees. Typically, what would happen is that workers from the two shifts would meet at the control point, and the incoming worker would apply their lock, and then the outgoing worker would remove theirs, and thereby transferring complete control of the energy control device to the incoming worker. And then we have the circumstance where we have outside contractors working on equipment in our facility. And the OSHA standard says that, and quoting from the standard again, whenever outside servicing personnel are to be engaged in activities covered by the scope and application of this standard, the on-site employer and the outside employer shall inform each other of their respective lockout or tagout procedure. The on-site employer shall ensure that his or her employees understand and comply with the restrictions and prohibitions of the outside employer's energy control program. And, this is to make sure that nobody inadvertently does something that hurts someone else because they might have a different way of looking at the procedures. And I don't think the standard specifically addresses this, but it also makes sense that the party that knows more about the dangers associated with a particular task, and that could be the outside contractor or the on-site employer, that party should advise the other on any deficiencies they might notice in the particular lockout, tagout, or other energy control safety procedures that are being used. Okay, now let's get into removing lockout, tagout devices. These devices should be removed only when the authorized employee has completed their work and verified that it is safe to re-energize the equipment. And very, very importantly, lockout devices should only be removed by the employee who applied the device. Again, this is very important because the whole purpose of this device is to protect the person who's doing the work. So they're the one who's in the position to know that they're safe and the device should be removed. Now, in real life, we may have to make an exception to the rule there may be circumstances where the employee who applied the LOTO device isn't available to remove it. And OSHA addresses this, and I'll read from the standard again. When the authorized employee who applied the lockout or tagout device is not available to remove it, the device may be removed under the direction of the employer, provided that specific procedures and training for such removal have been developed, documented, and incorporated into the employer's energy control program. The employer shall demonstrate that the specific procedure provides equivalent safety to the removal of the device by the authorized employee who applied it. The specific procedure shall include at least the following elements. First one is verification by the employer that the authorized employee who applied the device is not at the facility. Second one, making all reasonable efforts to contact the authorized employee to inform him or her that his or her lockout or tagout device has been removed. And the third one, ensuring that the authorized employee has this knowledge before he or she resumes work at the facility. And the point of this is to make sure that before you remove somebody's lockout tagout device, maybe they went home and forgot to take it off, or maybe they had to leave unexpectedly and weren't able to take it off. We want to make sure that there's no way they can return to work with the expectation that their lock is still applied and still controlling the energy on that device. Now let's talk a little bit about actual lockout tagout devices, and these are sort of requirements from the standard. Lockout tagout devices should be conspicuously and unambiguously identifiable as lockout tagout devices. So when someone sees the thing, they should know, oh, that's a LOTO device. And also, somewhat related, LOTO devices should not be used for any other purpose. And non-LOTO devices shouldn't be used for lockout tagout purposes. Right? These are intended to be safety devices, so we want it to be clear to everyone what is going on when they see one of these lockout tagout devices. Lockout tagout devices should be durable. They should be able to withstand the environment they will be exposed to for the maximum amount of time they are expected to be exposed without any loss of their protective effectiveness. These devices should be standardized. Every employee in the facility should be immediately able to identify the lockout tagout device as a lockout tagout device. The lockout devices should be substantial, right? They shouldn't be removable by unauthorized person without excessive force or unusual techniques. And there are plenty of vendors of compliant lockout tagout devices for general use, but it also might be necessary to develop custom devices for particular use cases. And I'll reiterate one more time that lockout tagout devices should never be removed by anyone other than the person that applied them, except, as I mentioned before, by documented procedures under very specific circumstances. Basically, the lockout tagout devices are intended to protect the person who applied them, and the people in harm's way should be the people that applied the devices. So therefore, the only people with the knowledge to safely remove them are those people, in fact. And that's about all I have to say about lockout tagout for now. You can find my notes for this topic at facilityscience.com, and this is number 16. If you have any questions or comments about this topic or suggestions for other topics you would like to hear about, you can contact me by email at podcast@facilityscience.com or at facilityscience on Twitter. If you think this podcast is useful and you want to help me keep making it, head over to facilityscience.com/support and see if any of the support options there appeal to you. As usual, I hope this is helpful to you, and thanks for listening.